Sarah Martinez limped through the automatic doors of St. Mary's Emergency Department, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an annoying frequency that made her temples throb, adding to the pounding headache she'd been nursing for the past 3 days. She clutched a crumpled insurance card in one hand and pressed the other against her lower back, where a sharp pain had been steadily worsening since she'd lifted a heavy box at her warehouse job. The waiting room was packed with the usual mix of late-night emergencies. A mother bounced a crying infant while her toddler tugged at her sleeve. An elderly man sat hunched over, coughing into a handkerchief. 2 teenagers whispered anxiously in the corner, one holding his wrist at an odd angle. Sarah found an empty plastic chair near the back and settled into it carefully, trying not to wince as the movement sent another spike of pain through her spine. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages, mostly work-related texts about shift changes and overtime opportunities. Sarah worked at a distribution center, loading and unloading trucks for barely above minimum wage. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills for her small studio apartment and kept food on the table. She'd been doing it for almost 2 years now, ever since she'd moved to Denver and started over. The waiting room television droned on with late-night news coverage. Sarah half-listened as the anchor discussed overseas military operations and veteran affairs. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to find a position that didn't aggravate the stabbing sensation in her back. The injury had happened during her shift yesterday, when she'd attempted to lift a particularly heavy package without proper form. Her supervisor had barely acknowledged her complaint and suggested she take some over-the-counter painkillers. But the pain hadn't improved. If anything, it had gotten worse, radiating down her left leg and making it difficult to sleep or even walk normally. Sarah had avoided seeking medical attention initially, partly because of the cost and partly because she'd always been reluctant to draw attention to herself. She'd learned to endure pain quietly, to push through discomfort without complaint. It was a habit formed over many years and reinforced by experiences she rarely allowed herself to remember. A young nurse called out names from a clipboard, and patients slowly filtered through the double doors leading to the examination rooms. Sarah watched the process with growing impatience, calculating in her head how much this visit was going to cost her. Even with insurance, emergency room visits were expensive, and she'd already had a dip in her meager savings account twice this month to cover unexpected expenses. She thought about her small apartment, sparse but clean, with its single window overlooking a parking lot. The walls were bare except for a calendar from the local grocery store and a single-frame photograph of a sunset she'd taken during a rare day off. Sarah had deliberately kept her living space minimal, free from reminders of her past life. She owned few possessions and preferred it that way. Fewer things meant fewer complications, fewer questions, fewer connections that could be severed. The pain in her back intensified, and she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. A woman sitting nearby noticed her discomfort and offered a sympathetic smile. Sarah nodded politely, but avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the attention. She'd learned to become invisible in crowds, to blend into the background and avoid drawing notice. It was safer that way, simpler. Her phone buzzed with a text from her coworker asking if she'd be able to work tomorrow's shift. Sarah stared at the message, knowing she couldn't afford to miss work, but uncertain whether she'd be physically capable of lifting boxes in her current condition. The distribution center was always short-staffed, and taking time off without adequate notice usually meant lost hours and lost pay. She typed back that she'd let him know in the morning, then put her phone away. The waiting room had a peculiar smell, a mixture of disinfectant and human anxiety. Sarah had spent time in military medical facilities before, but civilian hospitals had a different atmosphere. Everything seemed softer somehow, less efficient but more compassionate. The nurses moved with purpose, but without the crisp urgency she remembered from field hospitals. Doctors chatted casually with patients instead of barking orders or delivering information in clipped, professional tones. She remembered the first time she'd set foot in a military medical facility, fresh out of basic training and overwhelmed by the structured chaos of military life. Everything had been new then, intimidating and exciting in equal measure. Sarah had been young and eager, convinced she was embarking on a noble adventure that would give her life meaning and purpose. She'd been so naive, so unprepared for what lay ahead. The automatic doors opened again, admitting a paramedic crew wheeling in a patient on a stretcher. Sarah watched as they efficiently transferred their patient to hospital staff, rattling off medical information in rapid-fire succession. The injured person appeared to be conscious, but in significant pain, and the medical team moved with practice coordination to assess and stabilize them. Watching the controlled urgency of the medical response triggered something deep in Sarah's memory. For a brief moment, she could almost hear the distinctive whop-whop sound of helicopter rotors and feel the gritty sand that seemed to get into everything overseas. She could smell diesel fuel and antiseptic, hear voices shouting over radio static. But she pushed those thoughts away before they could fully form, focusing instead on the present moment and the throbbing in her lower back. A security guard made his rounds through the waiting area, checking on patients and ensuring everything remained calm and orderly. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes who seemed to genuinely care about the people under his watch. When he approached Sarah, she tensed slightly, an automatic response she couldn't quite suppress. But he simply asked if she needed anything and moved on when she shook her head. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself, suddenly, feeling cold despite the hospital's warm temperature. She'd chosen her outfit carefully that morning, opting for loose-fitting jeans and a plain sweatshirt that wouldn't draw attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for a small silver cross necklace that usually remained hidden beneath her clothes. The television continued its news coverage, now showing footage of a military ceremony honoring fallen soldiers. Sarah found herself watching despite her efforts to avoid such content. The images of grieving families and flag-draped coffins stirred emotions she'd worked hard to suppress. She turned away and focused on her hands, noting the small scars and calluses that told the story of her current life of manual labor. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from her banking app showing her current account balance. The number was depressingly low, just enough to cover her rent and utilities for the month if she was careful about groceries and other expenses. The emergency room visit would strain her finances significantly, but she couldn't continue working in her current condition. Time moved slowly in the waiting room, marked by the steady stream of patients being called back for treatment and new arrivals taking their places in the plastic chairs. Sarah observed the other people around her, noting their various injuries and ailments. Most seemed to have friends or family members accompanying them, people who asked concerned questions and offered comfort. Sarah sat alone, as she always did, by choice and by circumstance. She thought about calling her supervisor to explain her absence from work, but decided against it. He was a gruff man in his 50s who showed little patience for employee complaints or health issues. Sarah had learned to deal with him by being reliable and keeping personal problems to herself. She'd never mentioned her military background to him or anyone else at the warehouse. As far as her coworkers knew, she was just another employee who showed up on time, worked hard, and kept to herself. The waiting room gradually emptied as the night wore on, with new patients replacing those who'd been called for treatment. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, noting that she'd been waiting for almost 3 hours. Her back pain had become a constant, grinding presence that made it difficult to focus on anything else. She shifted positions repeatedly, trying to find some relief, but nothing helped. A young doctor emerged from the treatment area, looking tired but alert. He called out a name, and an elderly woman struggled to stand with the help of her adult daughter. Sarah watched them disappear through the double doors and wondered what her own examination would reveal. She'd always been healthy and strong, rarely needing medical attention beyond routine checkups. Physical fitness had been a cornerstone of her previous life, and she'd maintained her conditioning even after leaving the military. But warehouse work was taking its toll on her body in ways she hadn't anticipated. The repetitive lifting and constant standing were wearing down her joints and muscles. At 28, Sarah felt older than her years, marked by experiences that had aged her beyond her chronological age. Sometimes she caught herself moving with the careful deliberation of someone much older, protecting injuries that might not be visible but were always present. The automatic doors opened once more, and Sarah looked up to see a woman in scrubs approaching the reception desk. Something about her bearing caught Sarah's attention immediately. The woman moved with a confidence and alertness that seemed familiar, a way of scanning her surroundings that spoke of training and experience beyond typical medical education. Sarah studied the woman more closely, noting her posture and the way she interacted with the hospital staff. There was something almost military in her precision and efficiency, though she wore the same scrubs as the other medical personnel. The woman appeared to be in her mid-30s, with short brown hair and an athletic build that suggested regular physical training. As the woman in scrubs talked with the receptionist, Sarah felt a strange sense of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. Perhaps it was simply the recognition of someone who shared similar experiences, a kinship formed by common training and shared challenges. Sarah had occasionally encountered other veterans in civilian life, and there was often an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared experiences that didn't need to be verbalized. The woman finished her conversation with the receptionist and began moving through the waiting area, checking on patients and offering assistance where needed. When she approached Sarah's section of the room, their eyes met briefly, and Sarah felt a jolt of connection that she couldn't quite explain. The woman paused for a moment, as if she too sensed something familiar, but then continued on her rounds. Sarah's name was finally called by a tired-looking nurse with a clipboard. She stood carefully, gathering her jacket and purse, and followed the nurse through the double doors into the examination area. The corridors beyond the waiting room were quieter, lined with rooms containing patients in various stages of treatment. Sarah could hear the steady beeping of monitors and the quiet conversations between medical staff and patients. The nurse led her to a small examination room and instructed her to change into a hospital gown. Sarah complied, folding her clothes carefully and placing them on a chair. The gown was thin and open in the back, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She sat on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her, and waited for the doctor to arrive. The room was sterile and impersonal, decorated only with anatomical charts and medical equipment. Sarah studied the posters showing the human spine and muscular system, trying to identify where her pain might be originating. The examination table was uncomfortable, and she found it difficult to sit still as the pain continued to radiate through her lower back and leg. She thought about the woman she'd seen in the waiting room, wondering what had prompted that moment of recognition. Sarah had become adept at reading people, at identifying potential threats and allies through subtle cues and body language. It was a skill honed through years of training and field experience, and it had served her well in civilian life as well. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts, and a young resident entered with a tablet and a professional smile. He introduced himself and began asking questions about her symptoms, typing notes as Sarah described the progression of her back pain. His questions were thorough but routine, covering her medical history and current medications. When he asked about her occupation, Sarah simply stated that she worked in a warehouse. When he inquired about previous injuries, she mentioned a few minor incidents but omitted the more significant trauma she'd experienced during her military service. Some information was better left unshared, particularly in civilian medical settings where the context might not be understood or appreciated. The resident conducted a basic physical examination, testing her reflexes and range of motion. Sarah submitted to the tests without complaint, though some of the movements sent sharp spikes of pain through her body. She'd learned to endure discomfort without showing it, to maintain composure even when experiencing significant pain. The doctor explained that they would need to take X-rays to rule out serious structural damage, and possibly an MRI if the initial imaging was inconclusive. Sarah nodded her understanding, already calculating the additional cost these tests would add to her bill. But she knew the examination was necessary, and delaying treatment would only make the problem worse. As the resident left to order the imaging studies, Sarah sat alone in the examination room, listening to the sounds of the busy emergency department beyond her door. She could hear the urgent voices of medical staff responding to new emergencies, the quiet conversations between doctors and nurses, and the occasional cry of pain from a patient in distress. The familiar sounds of a medical facility brought back memories she'd tried to suppress. Images of makeshift operating rooms and field hospitals where she'd spent countless hours treating wounded soldiers. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was safe now, that the chaos and danger of her previous life were behind her. But sometimes the past felt closer than she wanted to admit, lurking just beneath the surface of her carefully constructed new life. And tonight, surrounded by the controlled urgency of an emergency room, those memories felt particularly close. The radiology technician was a cheerful woman in her 40s who chatted casually while positioning Sarah for the X-rays. Sarah appreciated her professional demeanor and the way she explained each step of the process. The imaging equipment was modern and efficient, quite different from the portable units she remembered from field hospitals where conditions were often less than ideal. As she lay on the cold table, Sarah stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to keep her mind focused on the present. The technician positioned the heavy lead apron over her torso and stepped behind the protective barrier to take the images. The machine whirred and clicked, capturing pictures of her spine from multiple angles. After the X-rays were completed, Sarah was directed to wait in her examination room while the radiologist reviewed the images. The process took nearly an hour, during which time she could hear the constant activity of the emergency department continuing around her. Nurses hurried past her door. Doctors consulted in hushed tones, and new patients were admitted with various injuries and ailments. Sarah found herself thinking about her apartment and the simple life she'd built for herself in Denver. It wasn't much by most standards, but it represented stability and independence after years of upheaval. She'd chosen the city partly because it was large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough to feel manageable. The mountains visible on clear days reminded her of landscapes from her childhood, before everything had changed. The warehouse job had been her choice as well, despite its physical demands and modest pay. She deliberately sought work that didn't require extensive background checks or personal references. The hiring manager had been satisfied with her identification documents and her willingness to work overtime. Her coworkers were a diverse group of people, many of whom were also starting over for various reasons. She made a few casual friends at work, people she could chat with during breaks or grab a quick lunch with occasionally. But Sarah kept those relationships at a comfortable distance, sharing little about her past or personal life. She learned that most people were content with surface-level interactions, and she preferred it that way. The door opened, and the young resident returned with a tablet displaying her X-ray results. He explained that the images showed some minor disc degeneration and muscle strain, but no serious structural damage. The pain was likely caused by inflammation that could be treated with anti-inflammatory medication and physical therapy. He recommended a few days of rest, followed by a gradual return to normal activity. Sarah listened carefully to his instructions, taking mental notes about dosage and frequency for the prescribed medication. She asked practical questions about work restrictions and timeline for recovery. The resident provided a written work note excusing her from heavy lifting for 1 week, which would give her body time to begin healing. As he prepared to discharge her, the resident mentioned that a physical therapy consultation might be beneficial for preventing future episodes. Sarah nodded politely, but privately doubted she would follow through with that recommendation. Physical therapy meant additional appointments, more medical bills, and more opportunities for healthcare providers to ask probing questions about her history. The nurse who had originally brought her back appeared with discharge paperwork and a prescription for anti-inflammatory medication. Sarah signed the necessary forms and listened to the instructions for follow-up care. The nurse was kind and thorough, making sure Sarah understood all the recommendations before allowing her to leave. As Sarah changed back in her street clothes, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that her injury wasn't serious, but apprehension about returning to work and the financial impact of missing shifts. The warehouse supervisor would not be pleased about the work restrictions, and Sarah knew she'd have to be strategic about managing the situation. She gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the examination room when she heard a commotion in the hallway outside her door. Voices were raised in what sounded like an urgent medical situation, with staff members calling out instructions and moving quickly. Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle, as the sounds triggered memories of similar emergencies in very different settings. Through the thin walls, she could hear someone directing the response to what appeared to be a trauma case. The voice was calm, but authoritative, cutting through the chaos with clear instructions and medical terminology. Something about the tone and cadence struck Sarah as familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. She opened her door cautiously and stepped into the hallway, where she could see medical staff rushing toward one of the trauma bays. A team of doctors and nurses surrounded a gurney where a patient appeared to be in critical condition. The scene was controlled chaos, with each team member performing their assigned role with practiced efficiency. Sarah found herself drawn toward the activity, though she remained at a respectful distance. Her eyes were automatically assessing the situation, noting the organized response and the clear chain of command that had been established. It was the kind of coordinated medical emergency response she'd witnessed countless times before, though in very different circumstances. The woman she'd noticed earlier in the waiting room was now clearly visible, standing at the head of the trauma team and directing the resuscitation efforts. She moved with absolute confidence, her hands steady as she performed procedures while simultaneously coordinating with other team members. Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. Sarah watched, transfixed as the woman worked. There was something about her presence that commanded respect from the entire medical team. Even the senior attending physician seemed to defer to her judgment on certain aspects of the patient's care. She performed advanced procedures with the kind of precision that came only from extensive training and experience. The patient on the gurney appeared to have suffered multiple traumatic injuries, possibly from a motor vehicle accident. Sarah could see the characteristic patterns of blunt force trauma and the rapid assessment protocols being implemented. The medical team worked systematically through their evaluation, with a mysterious woman coordinating their efforts like a conductor leading an orchestra. As Sarah observed the resuscitation, she noticed several things that seemed unusual for a typical emergency room response. The woman's techniques were exceptionally advanced, incorporating procedures that suggested specialized trauma training beyond standard civilian medical education. Her knowledge of battlefield medicine principles was evident in her approach to the patient's injuries. But what struck Sarah most profoundly was the woman's demeanor under pressure. She remained absolutely calm in the face of a life-threatening emergency, making rapid decisions with the kind of confidence that could only be developed through extensive experience with similar situations. Sarah recognized that level of composure because she'd once possessed it herself. The woman glanced up briefly while working, and Her eyes met Sarah's across the hallway. For a moment, time seemed to stop as they looked at each other. Sarah saw something in the woman's expression that she recognized immediately. The careful alertness of someone who'd been tested in extreme circumstances, the quiet strength of someone who'd seen too much, but continued to serve anyway. The moment passed quickly as the woman returned her attention to the patient. But Sarah remained frozen in place, processing what she'd just witnessed. The medical team successfully stabilized the trauma patient, and the urgency of the situation began to diminish. Staff members started to disperse, returning to their other duties as the patient was prepared for transport to surgery. Sarah retreated toward the exit, overwhelmed by the emotions the scene had triggered. She'd spent 2 years carefully avoiding situations that might remind her of her previous life, but tonight she'd stumbled into a scenario that brought everything rushing back. The precision, the pressure, the life and death responsibility, it was all too familiar. She made her way back to the waiting room, which had emptied considerably since she'd first arrived. The late hour meant fewer patients were seeking emergency treatment, and the atmosphere was quieter and more subdued. Sarah sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs, her mind racing with thoughts and memories she'd tried to suppress. The woman from the trauma team appeared in the waiting area, having apparently finished her shift. She moved through the room, collecting personal belongings from a locker, and Sarah noticed that she carried herself with the same alert posture even when off-duty. Her civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater couldn't disguise the underlying discipline in her movements. As the woman prepared to leave, she noticed Sarah sitting alone in the waiting area. She approached slowly, her expression curious but not intrusive. When she spoke, her voice was the same calm, authoritative tone Sarah had heard during the resuscitation. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen something that bothered you." The woman's concerns seemed genuine, and her direct approach reminded Sarah of military briefings where important information was communicated efficiently and without unnecessary elaboration. Sarah hesitated, uncertain how to respond. She'd become accustomed to deflecting personal questions and avoiding meaningful conversations about her past. But something about this woman's presence made her usual deflection strategies feel inadequate. "I'm fine," Sarah replied automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just finished with my examination. Back injury from work." The woman nodded understandingly, but her eyes suggested she detected more than Sarah intended to reveal. She sat down in the chair next to Sarah, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to read situations and people with professional precision. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez," she said, extending her hand. "Emergency medicine, but I also do trauma surgery when needed." Her handshake was firm and confident, the grip of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. "Sarah Martinez," she replied, noting that Dr. Vasquez's introduction had been deliberately professional yet personal. It was the kind of introduction that invited further conversation while respecting appropriate boundaries. "Mind if I ask what kind of work causes back injuries? I see a lot of workplace trauma, and I'm always curious about prevention strategies." Dr. Vasquez's question was casual, but indicated genuine professional interest rather than idle curiosity. "Warehouse work. Loading trucks, moving inventory. Nothing too exciting." Sarah's response was truthful, but deliberately minimal, designed to satisfy the question without encouraging further inquiry. Dr. Vasquez nodded again, but Sarah sensed that she was processing more information than the simple answer provided. Her observational skills seemed exceptionally well developed, and Sarah felt like she was being quietly assessed in ways that went beyond casual conversation. "Physical labor can be tough on the body, especially if you're not using proper ergonomics," Dr. Vasquez observed. "Have you done that kind of work long? You seem like someone who might have had different training at some point." The question was carefully phrased, offering Sarah an opportunity to share more information without directly asking about her background. Sarah recognized the technique. It was similar to interrogation methods she'd learned for gathering intelligence without making subjects feel threatened or defensive. Couple of years, Sarah answered, then added somewhat impulsively, I used to do different work before that. It was more than she'd intended to say, but something about Dr. Vasquez's presence made her usual guardedness feel less necessary. The woman radiated competence and trustworthiness in a way that reminded Sarah of the best officers she'd served under. Career changes can be challenging, Dr. Vasquez said diplomatically. Sometimes we end up doing work that doesn't match our training or interests, but we do what we have to do. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with difficult transitions, and Sarah found herself wondering about the doctor's own background. Her medical skills were obviously exceptional, but there was an additional layer of training evident in her approach to emergency situations. What about you? Sarah asked, surprising herself with the question. Have you always worked in civilian hospitals? Dr. Vasquez smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw something other than professional composure in her expression. The smile was knowing, almost conspiratorial, as if Sarah had asked exactly the right question. Not always, no, Dr. Vasquez replied carefully. I spent some time in military medicine before transitioning to civilian practice. Different environment, different challenges, but the core mission remains the same, taking care of people who need help. The confirmation of what Sarah had suspected sent a jolt of recognition through her. She'd been right about the military bearing and the specialized training. Dr. Vasquez was a veteran, someone who'd served in medical roles during deployment and then successfully transitioned to civilian health care. How long ago? Sarah found herself asking, though she immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. About 5 years since I got out. Took a while to adjust to civilian medicine, but I eventually found my place here. Dr. Vasquez's answer was honest and direct, suggesting she was comfortable discussing her military background. Sarah nodded, processing this information and wondering how much of her own situation Dr. Vasquez might have already deduced. Veterans often recognized each other through subtle cues and shared experiences, even when those experiences weren't explicitly discussed. It can be hard to adjust, Sarah said quietly, offering her own small acknowledgement of shared understanding. Yes, it can be, Dr. Vasquez agreed, especially when you go from work that feels meaningful and important to jobs that feel different. The observation struck Sarah as particularly perceptive, touching on something she'd struggled with but never articulated clearly. Her warehouse job provided necessary income, but it lacked the sense of purpose and significance that had defined her previous career. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both apparently lost in their own thoughts. The waiting room had become almost deserted, with only a few patients remaining and minimal staff activity visible. The late hour and the intensity of their conversation created a sense of isolation from the outside world. Can I ask you something? Dr. Vasquez said eventually, and feel free to tell me it's none of my business. Sarah tensed slightly, anticipating a question she might not want to answer, but nodded for her to continue. When you were watching the trauma response earlier, you looked like someone who understood what was happening. Not just medically, but operationally, like you'd seen similar situations before. The question was direct, but not accusatory, offered with the kind of professional curiosity that indicated genuine interest rather than idle gossip. Sarah realized that her observation of the resuscitation had been more obvious than she'd intended. I might have, Sarah admitted carefully. In a different context, it was the closest she'd come to acknowledging her military background to anyone since arriving in Denver. The admission felt both liberating and terrifying, opening a door she'd kept carefully locked for 2 years. Dr. Vasquez nodded understandingly, as if Sarah's cautious response had provided all the confirmation she needed. Her expression showed no judgment, only the recognition of someone who understood the complexity of transitioning from military to civilian life. If you ever want to talk about it, or if you're interested in using your background in a different way, let me know, Dr. Vasquez said, reaching into her purse for a business card. We're always looking for people with your kind of training and experience. Sarah accepted the card, noting that it listed Dr. Vasquez's contact information at the hospital along with her credentials in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. The offer was generous and unexpected, suggesting possibilities Sarah hadn't previously considered. "I should probably get going," Sarah said, standing carefully and testing her back pain. The anti-inflammatory medication hadn't taken effect yet, but the pain seemed more manageable than it had been earlier. "Take care of yourself," Dr. Vasquez said, also standing. "And remember what I said. Sometimes our past experiences can open doors we didn't know existed." As Sarah left the hospital and walked to her car in the parking garage, she found herself thinking about Dr. Vasquez's words and the unexpected connection they'd shared. For 2 years, she'd worked to separate herself completely from her military background, viewing it as a chapter of her life that was permanently closed. But meeting Dr. Vasquez had reminded her that some experiences, even difficult ones, could be transformed into something positive and meaningful. The skills she developed during her military service didn't have to be hidden or forgotten. They could potentially be redirected toward new purposes and opportunities. Sarah drove home through the quiet Denver streets, Dr. Vasquez's business card tucked safely in her wallet. The encounter had shaken her carefully constructed routine, but it had also planted a seed of possibility that she couldn't quite dismiss. Maybe there were ways to honor her past while building a different kind of future. The city lights blurred past her windows as she navigated the familiar route to her apartment, her mind churning with thoughts and memories that felt both dangerous and potentially liberating. Change was never easy, especially when it involved confronting aspects of herself she'd worked hard to suppress. But for the first time in 2 years, Sarah Martinez allowed herself to consider that maybe, just maybe, her past didn't have to be a burden she carried in silence. Maybe it could be transformed into something that gave her life meaning and purpose once again. Sarah stared at Dr. Vasquez's business card for the third time that morning, turning it over between her fingers as she sat at her small kitchen table. 3 days had passed since her emergency room visit, and her back pain had improved enough for her to consider returning to work. But the conversation with Dr. Vasquez lingered in her mind, creating an uncomfortable tension between her carefully maintained anonymity and an unexpected possibility for change. The warehouse supervisor had been predictably unsympathetic about her injury, grudgingly accepting the doctor's note, but making it clear that accommodations would be temporary. Sarah's co-workers had offered casual sympathy and share their own stories of workplace injuries, but none seemed particularly surprised by her situation. Industrial accidents were common enough in their line of work. She'd spent the past few days in her apartment, taking the prescribed medication and trying to rest her back as instructed. The forced inactivity had given her too much time to think, and her mind kept returning to the night at the hospital. Watching Dr. Vasquez coordinate the trauma response had reminded Sarah of capabilities she'd forgotten she possessed, skills that had once defined her identity and purpose. Her military service had ended abruptly under circumstances she rarely allowed herself to remember. The transition to civilian life had been jarring and disorienting, leaving her feeling disconnected from everything she'd previously believed about herself. She'd chosen warehouse work partly because it required no explanation of her background and no demonstration of specialized knowledge. But meeting Dr. Vasquez had disrupted that comfortable anonymity. For the first time since her discharge, Sarah had encountered someone who might understand both her capabilities and her reluctance to discuss them. The doctor's invitation to consider using her background differently had planted an idea that refused to be dismissed. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her warehouse supervisor's number, and she answered with some trepidation. "Martinez? You planning to come back to work today, or what?" His voice carried its usual impatient edge. "Yes, sir. I can return today, but I still have restrictions on heavy lifting for a few more days." "Yeah, well, we're short-handed, and I need all available workers on the loading dock. You can do light duty for now, but don't expect it to last forever." Sarah assured him she'd be there for her regular shift, and ended the call, already dreading to return to work. The job had never been particularly fulfilling, but it had provided the income and anonymity she'd thought she wanted. Now it felt like a trap that was slowly suffocating her potential. She dressed in her usual work clothes, jeans, steel-toed boots, and a plain t-shirt, and prepared for another day of mindless physical labor. But as she gathered her things, she impulsively grabbed Dr. Vasquez's business card and slipped it into her wallet. She wasn't sure why, but having it with her felt like keeping options open. The warehouse was a vast, noisy space filled with towering shelves of merchandise and the constant movement of forklifts and loading equipment. Sarah reported to her supervisor, who assigned her to inventory duties that would keep her away from heavy lifting. It was boring work, but it allowed her to move at her own pace and avoid aggravating her back injury. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Vasquez's comment about finding meaningful work. During her military service, every day had been driven by clear purpose and defined objectives. Even the most dangerous assignments had carried the satisfaction of knowing she was contributing to something larger than herself. Warehouse work offered none of that satisfaction. The products she moved and counted were just consumer goods flowing through a distribution network. There was nothing inherently wrong with the work, but it felt hollow after years of life and death responsibility. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the employee break room, mechanically eating a sandwich while her coworkers discussed weekend plans and workplace gossip. She'd never felt like she truly belonged with this group, despite their casual friendliness. They were good people dealing with their own challenges, but Sarah had learned to keep her distance from potential complications. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, Sarah. This is Dr. Vasquez from the ER. Hope your back is feeling better. Would you like to meet for coffee sometime this week? I'd love to continue our conversation." Sarah stared at the message, surprised by the direct outreach. She'd assumed their hospital encounter would remain an isolated incident, a brief moment of connection that would fade into memory. The invitation to meet again suggested that Dr. Vasquez had been as affected by their conversation as Sarah had been. She typed and deleted several responses, uncertain how to handle the unexpected contact. Part of her was intrigued by the possibility of talking with someone who might understand her background and current struggles. But another part worried about the complications that could arise from developing any kind of relationship. Finally, she typed a simple response. "Back is improving. Thanks. Coffee sounds okay. When works for you?" The reply came within minutes. "Tomorrow evening? There's a quiet place called Mountain View Cafe on 16th Street. 7 p.m. Sarah agreed to the meeting, then spent the rest of her shift second-guessing the decision. She'd worked hard to avoid situations that might lead to personal revelations or emotional entanglements. Coffee with Dr. Vasquez represented a departure from her established patterns of self-protection. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment, feeling physically exhausted but mentally restless. The light duty had been easier on her back, but standing for hours doing repetitive tasks had left her feeling drained in other ways. She heated a microwave dinner and ate it while standing at her kitchen counter, looking out the single window at the parking lot below. Her apartment reflected her minimalist approach to civilian life. The furniture was basic and functional, purchased from discount stores and secondhand shops. She owned few books, no television, and minimal decorative items. The space felt temporary, as if she might need to leave quickly and didn't want to accumulate possessions that would complicate her departure. But lately, the stark emptiness of her living space had begun to feel oppressive rather than liberating. She'd created a safe, anonymous existence, but it was also a lonely one. Her interaction with Dr. Vasquez had reminded her of connections she'd lost and needs she'd been ignoring. Sarah spent the evening researching Dr. Vasquez online, using the hospital website and medical databases to learn more about her background. The information was limited but impressive. Dr. Vasquez had completed her residency at a prestigious program, published research on trauma medicine, and received several awards for clinical excellence. What the official records didn't reveal was the extent of her military service or the circumstances of her transition to civilian medicine. Those details would require personal conversation, the kind of sharing Sarah had been avoiding since her discharge from the military. She went to bed early but slept poorly, her mind cycling through memories and possibilities. Dreams mixed fragments of her military service with images of the hospital emergency room, creating a disorienting narrative that left her feeling unsettled when she woke. The next day passed slowly at the warehouse, with Sarah completing her assigned tasks while thinking about the evening meeting. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, casual but neat, suggesting someone who had her life together without appearing to try too hard. It was a delicate balance that reflected her uncertainty about the encounter. Mountain View Cafe turned out to be a small, comfortable establishment with mismatched furniture and local artwork on the walls. The atmosphere was relaxed and conducive to conversation, quite different from the corporate coffee chains Sarah usually frequented. Dr. Vasquez had already arrived and was sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. "I hope black coffee is okay," Dr. Vasquez said as Sarah approached. "I wasn't sure how you liked it." Sarah thanked her and sat down, immediately noting that Dr. Vasquez had chosen a table with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the back exit. It was the kind of tactical positioning that came naturally to people with security training, another small confirmation of her military background. "How's the back feeling?" Dr. Vasquez asked, her professional concern evident. "Much better. I went back to work yesterday on light duty." Sarah sipped her coffee, which was strong and well-prepared. "Thanks again for the help at the hospital." "Of course. That's what we're there for." Dr. Vasquez paused, then continued more personally. "I have to admit, I've been thinking about our conversation. You seemed like someone who might understand some of the challenges I faced transitioning out of the military." The direct acknowledgement of their shared background created an opening Sarah hadn't expected. She prepared for careful probing and gradual revelation, not immediate honesty about military service. "What branch?" Sarah asked, deciding to meet directness with directness. "Navy. I was a flight surgeon attached to Marine units for most of my deployment rotations. Spent a lot of time in field hospitals and forward operating bases." Dr. Vasquez's answer was matter-of-fact, but Sarah detected underlying emotion beneath the clinical description. "How many deployments?" Sarah found herself asking, drawn into the conversation despite her usual reluctance to discuss military experiences. 3 tours over 6 years. Afghanistan mostly, sometime in other locations I can't really discuss. Dr. Vasquez's response indicated classified assignments and specialized operations, suggesting her military service had been more complex than routine medical duty. Sarah nodded, understanding both the spoken and unspoken elements of Dr. Vasquez's background. Military medicine in combat zones required exceptional skill and resilience, especially for personnel attached to Marine units conducting dangerous operations. "What made you get out?" Sarah asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. It was exactly the kind of inquiry she hoped to avoid about her own service. Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Cumulative stress, I guess. I love the work and the mission, but the pace and intensity weren't sustainable long-term. I also lost some good friends, and that started affecting my ability to function effectively." The honest admission of vulnerability surprised Sarah, who had expected more generic explanations about family considerations or career opportunities. Dr. Vasquez's willingness to discuss personal struggles suggested either exceptional emotional maturity or a deliberate strategy to encourage similar openness. "I'm sorry for your losses," Sarah said simply, recognizing the inadequacy of words but offering them anyway. "Thank you. It's part of the job, but that doesn't make it easier." Dr. Vasquez studied Sarah's face. "What about you? What branch and specialty?" The question Sarah had been dreading arrived with casual directness. She could deflect or change the subject, but something about Dr. Vasquez's honesty made deception feel inappropriate. Navy as well. Special operations. Combat medic attached to SEAL teams. The words felt strange to speak aloud after 2 years of silence about her background. Dr. Vasquez's eyebrows rose slightly, indicating recognition of the specialized nature of Sarah's former position. Combat medics assigned to special operations units received extensive training and operated under extraordinary conditions. That's impressive. How long did you serve? 6 years total. For deployments, various locations. Sarah kept her response deliberately vague, but the basic timeline provided context for understanding her level of experience. And you're working in a warehouse now? Dr. Vasquez's question wasn't judgmental, but it highlighted the dramatic contrast between Sarah's previous responsibilities and her current employment. It pays the bills and doesn't ask questions about my background. Sarah's response was more honest than she'd intended, revealing her desire for anonymity. But it doesn't use any of your training or experience. You must have incredible medical skills just sitting unused. The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. Sarah had indeed received extensive medical training, far beyond basic first aid. She'd performed complex procedures under extreme conditions, saved lives in situations where traditional medical facilities were unavailable. Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past, Sarah said, attempting to deflect the direction of the conversation. Is it, though? Dr. Vasquez leaned forward slightly. I understand wanting to escape certain aspects of military life. The bureaucracy, the deployments, the constant stress. But the skills we developed, the ability to help people in crisis situations, those don't have to be abandoned. Sarah felt defensive at the challenge to her chosen path of anonymity. It's complicated. Not everyone transitions as successfully as you have. You're right, it is complicated. And I didn't transition successfully at first. I spent almost a year working as a bartender because I couldn't handle the responsibility of making medical decisions again. Dr. Vasquez's admission revealed struggles Sarah hadn't expected. What changed? I realized I was wasting something valuable. Not just my training, but my ability to make a difference in people's lives. The trauma and loss I'd experienced didn't disqualify me from helping others. It actually made me better at it. The conversation was venturing into territory Sarah found both compelling and threatening. She'd built her new life on the premise that her military experiences were too difficult to integrate into civilian existence. What if the trauma is too much? What if using those skills brings back things you'd rather forget? Sarah's questions revealed more than she'd intended about her own struggles. Dr. Vasquez's expression softened with understanding. Then you could help processing those experiences. You don't have to carry them alone, and you don't have to let them define your entire future. Easier said than done. Absolutely. I spent 2 years in therapy working through my combat experiences before I felt ready to practice medicine again. But it was worth it to reclaim that part of myself. The mention of therapy created another moment of tension for Sarah, who had steadfastly avoided professional help for her own psychological challenges. She convinced herself that time and distance would heal her emotional wounds. Can I ask you something? Dr. Vasquez said. And, again, tell me to mind my own business if I'm overstepping. Sarah nodded, though she braced herself for another difficult question. When you were watching the trauma response at the hospital, I could see you assessing the situation. Your body language suggested someone who understood not just what we were doing, but how to do it better. Am I wrong about that? The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Sarah had indeed been evaluating the emergency response, noting techniques and protocols that could have been improved based on her combat experience. You're not wrong, Sarah admitted reluctantly. We could use someone with your background and skills. Combat medics attached to special operations have training that goes far beyond what most civilian paramedics receive. You could make a real difference in emergency medicine. The suggestion was both tempting and terrifying. Sarah could envision herself in a medical role again, using her skills to save lives in a controlled civilian environment. But she could also imagine the memories and emotions that such work might trigger. I don't have civilian medical credentials, she pointed out, looking for practical obstacles to the idea. That could be addressed through transition programs and additional training. The military experience would give you a significant advantage in any paramedic or nursing program. With your background, you could probably complete certification programs much faster than typical students. Dr. Vasquez was clearly serious about the possibility, having thought through the practical steps required for such a career change. Her enthusiasm was infectious, despite Sarah's reservations. "Why do you care about this?" Sarah asked. "You barely know me, because I recognize something in you that I remember feeling in myself. You're clearly intelligent and capable, but you're underutilizing your potential because you're afraid of confronting your past." I wasted a lot of time doing the same thing. The directness of Dr. Vasquez's assessment was both irritating and illuminating. Sarah didn't like having her motivations analyzed so accurately, but she couldn't deny the truth in the observation. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Start small. Come volunteer in the emergency department. See how it feels to use your medical skills again in a supportive environment. If it's too much, you can walk away. But if it feels right, we can talk about more formal training programs." The proposal was reasonable and low pressure, offering Sarah a way to explore the possibility without making major commitments. It also addressed her fear of being overwhelmed by returning to medical work too quickly. "I'd have to think about it." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But don't let fear make the decision for you." They talked for another hour about less emotionally charged topics: Denver's weather, local restaurants, books they'd read recently. The conversation revealed Dr. Vasquez to be thoughtful and well-read, with interests that extended far beyond medicine. She was the kind of person Sarah might have enjoyed as a friend under different circumstances. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Vasquez handed Sarah another business card, this one with her personal phone number written on the back. "Call me when you're ready to talk more about volunteering, or if you just want to talk about anything else. Sometimes it helps to have someone who understands where you've been." Sarah accepted the card, noting the generous offer of support beyond the professional opportunity. It had been a long time since anyone had made such an offer, and she wasn't sure how to respond appropriately. "Thank you for the coffee and the conversation. I'll think about what you said." As Sarah drove home, she reflected on the evening's discussion and Dr. Vasquez's challenge to her current path. The conversation had been more honest and revealing than any she'd had since leaving the military, and it had raised questions about choices she'd thought were settled. The possibility of returning to medical work was both exciting and terrifying, offering a chance to reclaim a part of herself she'd thought was permanently lost. But it also threatened to destabilize the carefully controlled existence she'd built as protection against her traumatic memories. Sarah spent the night considering Dr. Vasquez's invitation and the implications of accepting it. Change was never easy, especially when it involved confronting aspects of herself she'd worked hard to suppress. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from her past and start figuring out how to transform it into a meaningful future. 2 weeks after a coffee meeting with Dr. Vasquez, Sarah found herself standing in the hospital parking lot, staring at the emergency department entrance. She'd finally called about volunteering, enduring a brief but thorough screening process that had tested her resolve multiple times. Background checks, health clearances, and orientation sessions had filled her evenings for the past week. Now, wearing borrowed scrubs and a volunteer badge, she was about to enter a medical facility as a care provider for the first time in over 2 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the stethoscope around her neck, a piece of equipment that felt both familiar and foreign after her extended absence from medical work. Dr. Vasquez had arranged for Sarah to shadow experienced emergency department staff during her initial volunteer shifts, providing exposure to civilian trauma medicine without overwhelming responsibility. It was a careful reintroduction designed to test Sarah's readiness while protecting both her psychological well-being and patient safety. Sarah's warehouse supervisor had been predictably irritated by her request to change from full-time to part-time hours, but the facility's chronic staffing shortages had forced him to accommodate her schedule. She'd taken a significant pay cut, but her modest living expenses made the reduction manageable for the short term. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Sarah stepped into the familiar chaos of an active emergency department. The sounds and smells immediately transported her back to military field hospitals, triggering a complex mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She took a deep breath and reported to the nursing station where Dr. Vasquez was reviewing patient charts. "Ready for this?" Dr. Vasquez asked, looking up from her paperwork with an encouraging smile. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt, but her training in managing stress under pressure was already asserting itself. "Good. Today you'll be working with Nurse Patterson. She's one of our most experienced trauma nurses and an excellent teacher. Follow her lead, observe everything, and don't hesitate to ask questions." Nurse Patterson turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an authoritative presence that reminded Sarah of the best military medical personnel she'd worked with. She had the confidence that came from years of emergency medicine experience and the patience necessary for training newcomers. "Dr. Vasquez tells me you have extensive medical training," Nurse Patterson said as they walked toward the first patient assignment. "She was pretty impressed with your background." Sarah nodded, but didn't elaborate, still uncertain how much of her military experience to reveal to civilian medical staff. She'd learned that people sometimes had complicated reactions to learning about her special operations background. Their first patient was an elderly man who'd fallen at home and possibly broken his hip. Sarah observed as Nurse Patterson conducted the initial assessment, noting both similarities and differences between civilian and military medical protocols. The pace was more deliberate, the paperwork more extensive, but the fundamental principles of trauma evaluation remained consistent. "What's your assessment?" Nurse Patterson asked after completing her examination. Sarah studied the patient's presentation, automatically processing the clinical indicators she'd been trained to recognize. Probable hip fracture, given the mechanism of injury and his inability to bear weight. "He's stable, but we should get imaging to confirm the diagnosis and check for complications." "Exactly right. What else are you noting about his condition?" "He's dehydrated, probably from being on the floor for several hours before his neighbor found him. His skin color suggests possible early shock, and he'll need 4 fluids before we move him for x-rays." Nurse Patterson nodded approvingly. "You haven't lost your assessment skills. Dr. Vasquez was right about your training." The compliment felt good, but Sarah remained cautious about revealing the full extent of her capabilities. She performed much more complex procedures under far more difficult conditions, but civilian medicine required different skills and different approaches to patient care. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of emergency department work. The controlled environment and abundant resources were a stark contrast to the austere conditions of combat medicine, but the core mission remained the same, helping people in crisis situations. Her military training proved valuable in unexpected ways. Her ability to remain calm under pressure impressed the staff, and her efficiency in completing tasks freed up experienced personnel for more complex responsibilities. She could start IVs quickly, assist with procedures smoothly, and communicate clearly during emergency situations. But it was during the afternoon that Sarah's true capabilities became apparent to the emergency department staff in a way that would change everything. An ambulance crew rushed through the doors with a young construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding, sustaining multiple traumatic injuries. The patient was conscious but in severe distress, with obvious signs of internal bleeding and possible spinal trauma. The emergency team sprang into action, but the complexity of his injuries created immediate challenges. Sarah positioned herself at the periphery of the resuscitation, observing the coordinated response while staying out of the way. But as the situation developed, she began to notice problems with the team's approach. The patient's condition was deteriorating faster than the standard protocols could address. Dr. Vasquez was leading the resuscitation, but even her considerable skills were being challenged by the severity of the trauma. Blood pressure was dropping despite aggressive fluid replacement, and the patient's respiratory status was becoming increasingly unstable. "We need to get him a surgery immediately," Dr. Vasquez announced, "but he's not stable enough for transport." Sarah watched the team struggle with a complex clinical picture, her mind automatically processing alternative approaches based on her combat medicine experience. She'd managed similar cases in field conditions with limited resources and no backup surgical facilities. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward. "Dr. Vasquez, what if we tried a damage control approach? Stabilize the bleeding here and address the respiratory compromise before moving him?" The suggestion was made quietly, but several team members heard it and turned towards Sarah with surprise. Volunteers typically didn't offer clinical recommendations during major trauma resuscitations. Dr. Vasquez paused, considering Sarah's suggestion. "What specifically are you thinking?" "The bleeding pattern suggests injury to the splenic vessels. If we can get temporary control with external pressure techniques while addressing his airway, we might buy enough time for proper surgical intervention." The room went quiet as the medical team processed Sarah's assessment. Her technical language and confident analysis clearly indicated knowledge far beyond typical volunteer training. "That's exactly what I was thinking, but I wasn't sure about the field techniques," Dr. Vasquez said. "Can you assist?" Sarah hesitated for only a moment before moving to the patient side. "With your permission, I can show you the approach we use for similar injuries in combat situations." What happened next would be discussed in the emergency department for months afterward. Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, applying pressure techniques and positioning strategies that effectively controlled the patient's bleeding. Her movements were economical and confident, demonstrating skills that clearly came from extensive experience with traumatic injuries. While maintaining pressure on the bleeding sites, Sarah simultaneously assisted with airway management, anticipating the team's needs and providing critical support during the most challenging phases of the resuscitation. Her presence seemed to elevate the entire team's performance. Within 20 minutes, the patient was stable enough for emergency surgery. As the surgical team took over, the emergency department staff stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Dr. Vasquez approached Sarah, her expression mixing admiration with curiosity. "That was extraordinary. I've never seen field techniques applied that effectively in a civilian setting." Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable, having revealed capabilities she'd intended to keep hidden. The room was filled with medical professionals who had just watched her demonstrate skills that clearly indicated specialized military training. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," Sarah said quietly. "I should have stayed in my observer role." "Are you kidding? You may have saved that man's life." Nurse Patterson's voice carried clear admiration. "Where did you learn to do that?" The question Sarah had been dreading arrived with the directness she'd expected. The entire emergency department staff was looking at her, waiting for an explanation of her obviously advanced capabilities. Dr. Vasquez intervened before Sarah could respond. "Sarah has extensive military medical training. She's transitioning back into healthcare after completing her service." The explanation provided context without revealing specifics, but Sarah could see the recognition in her colleagues' faces. They understood that her skills indicated combat experience, probably in special operations units where advanced trauma medicine was essential. "How long were you deployed?" one of the residents asked. 4 tours over 6 years, Sarah replied, deciding that honesty was preferable to continued secrecy. "What unit?" The question came from a paramedic who had military experience himself. Sarah hesitated, then decided to trust the supportive environment Dr. Vasquez had created. "Navy Special Operations. Combat medic attached to SEAL teams." The room erupted in a mixture of impressed whistles and respectful murmurs. SEAL team medics were legendary within military medical circles, known for their exceptional training and the extreme conditions under which they operated. That explains a lot, Nurse Patterson said with a smile. We've been wondering why you seemed so comfortable with trauma procedures. The revelation transformed Sarah's status within the emergency department from curious volunteer to respected colleague. The staff's attitudes toward her shifted immediately, reflecting their understanding of her qualifications and experience. But Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and scrutiny. She'd spent 2 years avoiding exactly this kind of recognition, preferring anonymity to the complications that came with acknowledging her background. "I need some air," she said, heading toward the exit before anyone could respond. Dr. Vasquez followed her outside, finding Sarah sitting on a bench in the hospital courtyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscaping, creating a peaceful contrast to the intensity of the emergency department. "You okay?" Dr. Vasquez asked, sitting down beside her. "I didn't mean for that to happen. I just saw someone who needed help and reacted instinctively. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. You used your training to save someone's life. There's nothing wrong with that." Sarah struggled to articulate her conflicted feelings. "It's just that I've worked so hard to put all of that behind me, to be normal, anonymous. Now everyone in there knows who I used to be. Is that such a bad thing? You're incredibly skilled and experienced. Why hide that from people who could benefit from your knowledge? Because it brings back everything else. The missions, the casualties, the friends I couldn't save. Sometimes it's easier to pretend that person never existed." Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a moment, apparently considering her response. "I understand that instinct. I really do. But running from your past doesn't make it go away. It just prevents you from using your experiences in positive ways. What if I can't handle it? What if being back in medical situations brings back too much? Then we'll deal with it together. You don't have to face this alone, and you don't have to make any decisions right now. But what happened in there today shows that you still have the instincts and skills that made you exceptional at what you did." They sat in comfortable silence, watching hospital staff and visitors move through the courtyard. Sarah felt simultaneously drained and energized by the day's events, uncertain about what came next, but no longer convinced that hiding was the answer. "The patient we worked on today," Sarah said finally, "will he be okay?" Too early to tell definitively, but his chances improved significantly because of your intervention. The surgeon said your field techniques probably prevented him from bleeding to death before we could get him to the operating room. The confirmation that our actions had made a meaningful difference felt both satisfying and overwhelming. Sarah had forgotten the profound sense of purpose that came from using her skills to preserve life. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide whether you want to continue volunteering, and if so, whether you'd be interested in a more formal role in emergency medicine. We could use someone with your background and training. I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility again. Then, start with what you did today. Observe, assist when needed, and gradually take on more complex tasks as you feel comfortable. There's no rush and no pressure." As they returned to the emergency department to finish Sarah's shift, she noticed that her colleagues' attitudes toward her had indeed shifted. But instead of the uncomfortable scrutiny she'd feared, she encountered respect and genuine interest in her experiences. Several staff members approached her with specific questions about combat medicine techniques that could be applied in civilian settings. Dr. Vasquez assigned Sarah to less intense cases for the remainder of her shift, allowing her to process the day's events while continuing to observe emergency department operations. By the end of her volunteer period, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of returning to medical work. As she prepared to leave, Nurse Patterson approached with a scheduling request. "If you're interested, we could use your help during next weekend's overnight shift. That's when we typically see our most challenging trauma cases." The invitation represented a significant vote of confidence from the emergency department staff. Sarah realized that her performance during the construction workers' resuscitation had demonstrated her readiness for more complex responsibilities. "I'd like that," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the quickness of her response. Driving home that evening, Sarah reflected on the day's dramatic transformation of her circumstances. In a single afternoon, she'd gone from anonymous volunteer to recognized medical professional, forced to confront capabilities she'd tried to suppress and consider possibilities she'd thought were permanently closed. The construction worker's trauma had required her to act instinctively, drawing on training and experience she'd thought were too painful to access. But instead of triggering overwhelming memories, the emergency had felt natural and purposeful in ways her warehouse job never had. Dr. Vasquez had been right about the importance of not letting fear make decisions. Sarah's military experience, including its traumatic aspects, was part of who she was. Hiding from that reality had provided temporary protection, but it had also prevented her from using her capabilities in meaningful ways. Sarah arrived at her apartment feeling different than she had in months. The space that had once felt safely anonymous now seemed merely empty. She looked around the sparse rooms and wondered what it would be like to build a life based on purpose rather than avoidance. She picked up Dr. Vasquez's business card from her kitchen table and turned it over in her fingers, thinking about the conversation they'd shared and the opportunities that lay ahead. Change was never easy, especially when it involved confronting painful memories and abandoned dreams. But for the first time since leaving the military, Sarah Martinez felt ready to stop running from her past and start building a future that honored both her capabilities and her experiences. The emergency department had shown her that her skills could still make a difference, that her training could still save lives, and that her identity as a healer wasn't something she had to leave behind. Tomorrow she would return to her warehouse job, but it would be for the last time. She had volunteer shifts to complete, medical certifications to pursue, and a new chapter of her life to begin. The construction worker whose life she'd helped save would never know her name, but his crisis had reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten. Sometimes the best way to heal from trauma is to use your experience to prevent others from suffering the same fate. The room had indeed frozen when the SEAL medic revealed her combat past, but not from judgment or fear. It had been the stillness of recognition and respect, the acknowledgement that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who've been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to step forward and serve once again.